Prime Minister has not come into being, and also the change of cabinet has not been decided. What would that mean?
Well, I think it's normal for this sort of activity to take at least several days. I mean, we've seen some countries it can even take months, and I'm speaking from Brussels. So it's really not that unusual. I would say that they will need some time to decide.
Really?
On the new government.
Well,
no,
Mr. Yvan, I have to ask you, Brussels
yes.
Politics in Belgium is very different from a country that is facing a lot of crises like Ukraine, and therefore Brussels probably could afford several months of delay, but not in Ukraine.
No, certainly, but I'm sure they will manage to decide much quicker than several months. I mean, we can expect tomorrow and in the next days, I think, to have the announcement of the new government. They certainly cannot afford to spend too much time on infighting.
Mr. Babich, coming from the Russian perspective, we understand. The U.S. State Department spokesperson, even at the daily briefing, has been urging Rada, which is the parliament in Ukraine, to quickly come up with the plan, the reshuffling plan. What about from Russia's perspective? Many wonder what will the new cabinet's political tendency would be, pro-Russia or actually 100% pro-West, so-called?
Unfortunately, right now, the political orientation of Ukraine is 100% pro-US, pro-United States, also 100% pro-European Union, and this is not going to change. In fact, this is interesting that the countries which are now under the influence of the United States and the European Union, they can change personalities. I mean, Mr. Saakashvili was very unpopular in Georgia, so he had to leave. Right now, Mr. Yatsenyuk, who became very unpopular in Ukraine, he has to leave. But these countries cannot change their ideologies. Georgia remained anti-Russian even after Mr. Saakashvili left. And Ukraine will remain anti-Russian even as Mr. Yatsenyuk leaves. But I would not say, for example, that Mr. Yanukovych, before he was ousted, was pro-Russian. I think that Yanukovych also wanted to have good relationship with the West. He obviously had problems signing the association agreement with the European Union, but now we see that this association agreement was not very well prepared because, look, Ukraine lost so much in terms of GDP, and of course, not all of it can be explained by the war because the territory controlled by the separatists in the east of Ukraine is just 3%.
We're going to the economy. We're going to the economy of Ukraine, also with the Ukrainian gas. But for you, I would really like to follow up about Russia's intention. Many have wondered Russia's withdrawal of troops and influence apparently from Syria. Would that mean Russia is increasing its power and muscle toward the next round of even military struggle inside Ukraine? And how do you see Russia's influence in the overall political environment inside Ukraine?
Absolutely not. I would repeat that right now the rebels in the east of Ukraine control just 3% of the territory. They are obviously happy to have that much. Right now, the government in Ukraine is trying to explain the dramatic fall in the living standards by just the civil war inside Ukraine, but obviously this is not the main reason, because the industrial production fell all over the country. I think the main reason was the fact that the government did not want to have any economic ties to Russia. They even canceled the direct flights between Moscow and Kiev. And Russia, of course, is not going to introduce troops in the east of Ukraine, not regular units. There are no regular units. And Russia has no intention of occupying Ukraine. If Russia wanted to occupy Ukraine, it could have done so back in 2014.
Okay, let me go to Mr. Yvan here. We understand if the Russians already indicated their intention, what about from the West, including the United States and some of the European countries? We understand U.S. now has something called the European Reassurance Initiative, and that is coming from the annual defense budget from the U.S. At this moment, more than 300 billion in that category. What would that mean militarily for the European countries and also for countries within NATO in terms of its relations with Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia?
Sure. I mean, I would just add before answering your question that I think the description of Russia's intentions we just heard doesn't really have a lot to do with the actual practice of Russia. I mean, a country that had its territory annexed, that is still waging a war with its biggest neighbor, would obviously suffer economically. Now, regarding the NATO measures, it's clear that when you have in a neighborhood in Eastern Europe a country which breaks the fundamental principles of international law and of the fundamental principles of the European security order, the other countries need to take actions. They need to take actions to prepare for even for the wars. And we had a number of wars which involved Russia crossing the borders into Georgia, into Ukraine. Obviously, the countries in Eastern Europe are worried about such developments, and they do activate their alliances.
Well, there are a lot of countries paying attention to your country, I have to say, Mr. Sobolev. Glad to be connected now. May I have your opinion about the to be yet decided the new cabinet and the candidacy of a new prime minister vis-a-vis the already quite clear conflict between the prime minister, I mean the former one, and the president?
Okay. I've known Mr. Yatsenyuk personally since 15 years, and he's a good banker, and personally he's a committed person to reform, but he couldn't cope with the administrative job, you know, and the president has decided to accelerate reforms and to recruit more energetic, let me call, functionary, who is Mr. Groisman, and who is actually on the rostrum of the parliament and to be appointed the new leader of the new government. So I think that the coalition will be working hard under his leadership in the government to accelerate reforms and to restore the economic growth.
Well, Mr. Sobolev, I have to ask you further on that point. I'm not sure whether we do know exactly how the two plans you have talked about, which is anti-corruption and also bring better economic situation with the change of the personnel of the prime minister's position. We understand already the IMF certainly has, to a certain extent, lost its hope about the anti-corruption drive going on in your country, according to the IMF managing director, Ms. Lagarde. And also, your country has today decided with the parliament to erase the possibility of a moratorium supposed to be paid to the countries that have lent the money to your country. Many say this is already an obvious sign of default coming from Ukraine. That is a big issue. So, Mr. Sobolev, help us to understand how, with the change of one personnel in your government, that is likely to change.
Well, actually, you know, the IMF program has been really suspended for this governmental crisis, let me call it, because, well, this is not a typical or a classical governmental crisis or political crisis. This is an interpersonal crisis and more connected with the post-oligarch system, which has been partially ruined already. So we are very hopeful that the new government will complete the job, and the president will be also forced by the new government to accelerate the pace of reforms.
Mr. Yuvan, there have been...
The major part, the major part of that reforms have been over, especially the most painful one for the majority of population in terms of the tariff and prices rises and devaluation of the national currency.